Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me today. As always, this is optional, of course, so it really is above and beyond that you guys came here today. I hope to help you guys out and give you a little bit of feedback on what I've seen so far regarding your understanding of muscles and bones and the different actions that they produce. I will demonstrate for you some of these to hopefully clarify so that going into the exam you have a lot more confidence, right, and a lot more understanding of what exactly is going on. Okay, before we get into the actual content, are there any questions or feedback on anything at this point? Okay, I know that I've thrown so much at you guys this week. You know, as promised on day one of class, the course really does accelerate here at the end with the idea that it's really important to learn how to study A&P and to really get used to the course in the beginning. And so it goes a little bit more slowly, and now it really is lots and lots of information all at the same time. Hopefully you guys were able to start learning muscles and bones before now with those posted videos. Okay, I guess just one more note on that. All of the exercises that you guys are doing are all not busy work. They are meant to help you practice with the muscles and the bones, the different actions and types of contractions. If we were together in person, we would actually like stand up in class and be moving our joints, moving our muscles together, and so we would get that experience. Unfortunately, of course, we can't be with one another, and so these are just different ways of getting you guys to make sure that you are practicing and hopefully highlighting any misconceptions along the way. And so Flipgrid really helped me to see already. I know that they're not all in yet, but it really helped me to see where you guys are. Right. With that, I will elaborate just a little bit. Okay. Let's see. What can you expect for your exam? Your exam will open up later today. There's still a few things that I have to do on it, specifically to actually take some of those Flipgrid assignments and put them into the test, right? So you will actually see images from those videos that you guys made, made as anonymous as humanly possible. And you will be asked what types of movements, right, what types of contractions are being conducted in those particular images, which reference directly the videos that you guys have made. And so it is definitely in your best interest to take a look at all of the different videos. Until now, you guys have submitted videos just to me, so only I can see them and assess your understanding. But I really think it's important for you guys to see a multitude of different movements and see how muscles work in different contexts. And so that's why we went with Flipgrid this time. See, this is what you guys should be able to see from a student perspective. After we're done chatting today, we'll go through and give each of you individual feedback. If you guys submitted before like 10 o'clock last night, I have already emailed you that feedback on your videos, just so you know whether or not your thoughts are correct at this point. The other thing I'm going to do, and have provided an example right here, I am going to add to or add to your existing titles of your videos. And so here's what I'm saying. And so I'm saying the hip lateral rotation and abduction. This particular video is a great example and a correct example of hip lateral rotation and hip abduction. So if you want to study those, that movement, you should watch this video. And I already checked to make sure that it is correct and the muscles associated with these movements are also correct, right? So also knee flexion. Now, of course, this will take a little bit of time, and so definitely check in later this afternoon and watch these videos. Again, you will see some of this stuff again, okay? Yeah, okay. The other thing before I start dancing around here, You guys will have a multiple choice section. Ignore all of these dates and times and everything. This is from the spring semester. I don't have yours completely finalized just yet. But you'll have a multiple choice section just like you always have. Same situation, you should look through those, the quizzes you've taken, the Blackboard assignment, right? So you guys watched that YouTube video where the woman was doing some exercises and you said this is a, you know, shoulder extension, this is a shoulder flexion, right? And so you should take a look at that again as well. If you haven't been able to check on quizzes and assignments in the past, unfortunately, I can't really show you because I don't have the student perspective on Blackboard. But if you go into your grades and you click on the grade of the quiz or the grade of the Blackboard assignment, for example, the movement assignment, you should be able to see your answers and the correct answers. So if there's a problem with that, let me know. There's like 1,000 different things for me to click on Blackboard, and every once in a while, one thing or the other just doesn't get clicked. Okay, so yeah, let me know, but you should be able to go in and study those previous resources. That's one of the reasons why we take all of these different assessments. Okay. The other thing, in addition to the multiple choice, which is, you know, the same kind of a format, you will open it up, you'll have a certain amount of time, do your best to match and select and, you know, pick multiple choice answers. So that's the same as always, it is timed. But then we have this other open-ended component, and this is probably going to look largely the same for you guys as it did for the spring semester. Oops, that is not what I wanted to do. Actually, yes, it is what I wanted to do. Just kidding. Sorry, everyone. This is embarrassing. Good grief. Everything is like buried in here. Please forgive me. You try your best to set everything up and then technology, man. All right, so what I'm trying to get at here is that the open-ended component is not submitting a video like it was, like it has been for the last 2 exams. This time you will actually be typing into Blackboard what your answers are, right? So there's going to be 3 questions and they should look exactly like this. And so you'll be given the opportunity to type in your answer, right? So this one asks you what the functional classification of the joint is up here. So you'll type in, you know, 1, functional class, blah, blah, blah. 2, functional class, blah, blah, blah. 3, the structure matches the function, etc. And so you should be able to open this up, read the questions, and then close it out and come back to it later. Okay, so you're able to work on it as often as you want to before it's going to be due, I think at the end of the day tomorrow. So this will allow you, you know, as much time in theory as you need to take a look at, you know, this particular joint again, right? Take a look at the structures, right? If we know that this particular structure has blah, blah, blah function, you know, what would happen if this particular injury damaged this particular structure, right? The same thing, this is all one structure that has been damaged by an athletic injury, and so too is this one structure right here. And so again, you will just type in your thoughts, and you can come back to it as many times as you need, right? And then there will be another 2 questions. In the lab exercises, so the things that you've done on PhysioX, that's really the only like written feedback I've gotten from you guys, or written reflection of your knowledge. So far it's been mostly videos, and so from what I can gather from those particular exercises, occasionally students are missing multiple parts of the question, right? So they might answer you know, why the condition occurs, but then they might not give the names of the nerves, the muscles, and the bones that are involved. So definitely make sure to check that you have answered every single part of the question. For question number 1, it's broken down 1, 2, 3, A, B, and C. For question 2 and 3, it's not separated out for you, but there are still multiple questions, right? What actions are compromised, right? Which muscles should this patient strengthen to compensate for the loss? Okay, so that is what you will see. Again, I still have to finalize everything, so check for that this afternoon. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna stop and ask, are there any questions about content, about format? Okay, and I can say that if you have submitted your Flipgrid already, thank you guys so much. It is always wonderful to see you, and I really do enjoy being able to see your understanding, in video format. Okay, so I'm gonna try to demonstrate some stuff here. All right, so first of all, the multiple choice section of the exam is going to expect you to kind of apply the origins, insertions, actions, synergists, antagonists, all of those different kinds of things. For this particular section, we didn't have like 1 or 2 big physiological processes, right? It's not how do muscle cells work, or how do neurons work, or how does protein synthesis work, right? So we don't have these really big processes that you guys can explain. And so the physiological component of this section of the class is really just essentially understanding what muscles are going to be used to produce different types of movements. Okay, and so you kind of have to go backwards and forwards on this. So for example, I could say, what is the origin, insertion, and action of the biceps brachii? And you should be able to select those different origins, insertions, and actions. So that's kind of the forwards way. On the backwards way is I'm going like this. What muscle is producing that? And of course, what action is that at what joint? Okay, so probably the hardest part of this is that kind of backwards direction. Here's the movement, what muscles are producing said movement. And so that's why you guys have been kind of practicing that the most, because it is indeed the most challenging. All right, so I'm gonna step back here, and if you can't hear me, just let me know. I will try to speak up so that the computer can pick up on what I'm saying. Okay, so the first thing I want to mention, a little bit, the first thing that I want to mention is that hinge joints or modified hinge joints generally can only flex and extend, right? So those are the main movements involved. And so we have 2 of these modified hinge joints that we've been talking about in the 6 joints that you guys talked about on Flipgrid. That is the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, the hip, the knee, the ankle. Right? So those are the main 6 that we're talking about over and over again. Of those 6, 2 are modified hinge joints, right? So one of the 6 types of synovial joints, they are freely movable, and therefore, and the shape of those synovial joints gives rise to the different movements. The first here, the elbow, is a modified hinge joint, and so we can extend and flex at the elbow, right? So extending using the triceps brachii, flexing using the biceps brachii, okay? And so, all right, so flexing and extending, modified hinge joint. We cannot rotate the elbow. We cannot rotate the hand, right? And so what I saw in the Flipgrid videos that I've seen so far is that any kind of like this movement, right? So this movement was called rotation of either the elbow or the wrist. And so you're kind of on the right track. You're definitely taking steps in the right direction. But I want to point out that any of this type of movement, right? So this rotation is all happening up here, right? So the shoulder is where rotation is occurring, okay? So when you put your arm out to the side to carry a tray of drinks, right? That is all happening up here in the shoulder, okay? And so to reiterate this, I am locking my elbow right? That is, my biceps brachii and triceps brachii are both actively engaged. Cross-bridge cycles are occurring, but the muscles, the biceps brachii and triceps brachii, are not shortening or lengthening. They are staying the same length. So both of these muscles, these antagonist muscles, are both completing isometric contractions, right? They're locked in place, they're engaged, right? If they were completely relaxed, my arm would just kind of like fall down, right? So they're both actively engaged. I am keeping my elbow at a 90-degree angle, okay? And so I'm doing that to show you just how much movement there is out here by tiny little movements up here in your rotator cuff, okay? So if I want to medially rotate, this is medial rotation. If you feel your shoulder, I can't see you, but maybe you could do this with me. You can feel the muscles of your shoulder moving, right, as your hand comes down to go on your hip. Okay, so this is medial rotation. Again, it's happening completely in the shoulder, not in the elbow. The elbow is locked, right? It's a hinge joint. It can only flex and extend. It cannot medially rotate. At the same time, this is lateral rotation, right? Hand out for a drink, lateral rotation, hands in on your hips, medial rotation. That's all happening at the shoulder joint, okay? Another note about the shoulder joint, okay? I've seen a little bit of confusion about movements at the shoulder. There are two different things happening in your shoulder, what we would commonly call the shoulder. First of all, there's all of this movement of your arm, right? So all of these different movements, right? Abduction, adduction, lateral rotation, medial rotation, right? All of these movements are all happening here in your shoulder. Those movements are actually between the glenoid cavity of your scapula and the head of the humerus. Okay, so that is the shoulder joint. This is different, although in common terminology, we would probably call it the same thing, but this is different than moving the scapula itself. Okay. So, right, the shoulder joint is the head of the humerus and the glenoid cavity of the scapula. And again, abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, okay? And of course, lateral rotation and medial rotation, okay? Your pectoral girdle, right? So this essentially disconnected ring of bone around your rib cage up here on the superior side. These we would call our shoulders, but this is actually moving the pectoral girdle, right? So it's moving the entire shoulder blade, okay? And so the trapezius, for example, is going to insert on the scapula and the clavicle, okay? And so that is actually moving the shoulder blades. It's moving the scapulae, not the shoulder joint, right? The shoulder joint is moving your arm, the pectoral girdle muscles, right? So the trapezius, the rhomboideus minor and major, the levator scapulae, right? All of those different muscles here are playing with the shoulder blades. And so that's not one of our 6 joints that we're talking about. There is one muscle, the serratus anterior, which is essentially going to be right here on the ribs, that actually passes anterior to the scapula and inserts over here on the medial edge of the scapula. And so what this essentially does is it rotates this pointy part down here, right? So this pointy part of the scapula, and it rotates it up in this direction. And so what that is doing is it is helping with some of the muscles of your actual shoulder joint over here. Right, so if you wanted to say safe, right? So in baseball, safe, right? You can do that without moving your pectoral girdle, right? Your scapula, your clavicles are all in place. But as you pull your arms up to say field goal, what's going to happen is that the greater tubercle of the humerus is going to hit the acromion of your scapula, okay? And so we pretty much can't lift our arms above here, right, so parallel with the ground, unless we literally rotate the shoulder. So essentially, here's your glenoid cavity. We rotate the glenoid cavity up so that this humerus doesn't hit the acromion here. And so what I'm getting at here is that all of the shoulder movements are within this glenohumeral joint, this particular shoulder joint. But in order to produce some movements, such as this, we have to also contract the pectoral girdle muscles. Okay, so that's kind of a minor component, but I did want to clarify that because I had seen a little bit of confusion over that. Okay, other movements that I want to clarify. Right, I was talking about how hinge joints, right, so of the knee and of the elbow, flex and extend, flexion and extension, because of just the way that they are designed. However, there are a couple other movements that are produced, particularly in the elbow. And remember that the elbow is actually a joint between the humerus and the ulna and the radius, okay? And so the actual hinge part of the elbow joint is between the ulna and the humerus, right? Remember that this that this trochlea of the humerus fits into the trochlear notch of the ulna. Oh my gosh, words today. And so the way that these two lock together means that at this particular joint between the ulna and the humerus, these are the only movements you get, right? So pure flexion, there's no twisting whatsoever at the elbow joint. However, we have this funny radius. The head of the radius is very round. It fits over that capitulum. And so what this does is it allows what I have seen some students call rotation. And I totally understand why you would think that. That's perfectly logical train of thought. However, we don't quite call it that. Okay. Yes, the head of the radius twists over that capitulum, right? And so the movement that we see isn't actually in the elbow, right? Even though that is where this movement is occurring. But in our body, we see this movement in our hand, right? So here is anatomical position, right? Everything is nice and parallel. When our thumb passes over our pinky, right? I've seen you guys call this rotation. It is not rotation. This movement is pronation, putting your hand, the palm of your hand essentially down, sticking your hand out for a stamp. Thumb back over pinky, right? So sticking your hand out for money is supination. So supination, get a stamp, pronation, right? And all of that is happening in the elbow joint. It has nothing to do with your hand, right? Pronation, supination. Okay, and so those movements are conducted by, again, muscles in the elbow joint, not extensor carpi radialis, not flexor carpi ulnaris, none of those muscles. Those are muscles moving the hand, okay? And even though the hand is moving, that movement is produced up here at the elbow, right? So the pronator teres and the supinator are what produces these movements of the hand. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, I feel like this is probably the most challenging part to do not face-to-face. Okay, so you've been able to see the arms so far. I'm gonna step back, and again, if you can't hear me, let me know. But I'm gonna try to give you some leg movements. I can get the camera to not fall face first. Okay, so just like with the arm, all of the rotation and adduction cannot occur in a hinge joint, right? The knee is a hinge joint. Flexion, extension, okay? That's pretty much all you've got in the knee. There is a little bit of twisting, but of course, if you're an athlete, you know that lots can go wrong if there's too much twisting, right? And so all of the other movements of your leg are happening here in your hip. Ball and socket joint, lots of different types of movements. Okay, so just like I did with the elbows, I'm going to lock my knee. All right, so again, both or all of the muscles of my thigh are actively engaged at this point. They are maintaining the same length. So both my quadriceps femoris and my hamstrings are engaged in an isometric contraction. Right? They are working. Cross bridge cycles are happening, but the muscle is not shortening or lengthening at all. Okay? And so to show you rotation, I'm locking my knee, okay, so that you can see the movement at my hip. Right? So if I put my knee out to the side, right, this is nothing to do with the knee is doing the same darn thing it always has. It's just flexed. This rotation out to the side is lateral rotation, medial rotation. Okay, and of course, abduction and adduction at the hip. Okay, other things about the hip joints. Just like we talked about before, and I believe you even had an extra credit question on this at some point, muscles that are crossing over the hip joint on the anterior side, right? Those iliopsoas muscles, they are not something that you can, go to the gym and actually see them getting bigger and bigger and stronger. But of course, they are getting bigger and bigger and stronger. The iliopsoas muscles are responsible for pulling the femur up. So this is flexion at the hip. This is extension at the hip. Flexion, extension. Okay, and so iliopsoas muscles shorten to pull your femur up, right? So flex, right? And so this movement of pulling your leg up like this, flexing at the hip, is shortening the iliopsoas muscles. Okay, and so that would be a concentric isotonic contraction. Okay, so isotonic has two different types. There's the shortening type and the lengthening type. The shortening type, concentric isotonic, is happening here in the iliopsoas muscles when the hip is flexed. At the same time, your gluteus maximus muscle, for example, there are a few different extensors, but in general, the gluteus maximus muscle must lengthen as the iliopsoas shortens. Okay, so again, when I flex my hip, the gluteus maximus is lengthening, and therefore this would be an eccentric isotonic contraction and a concentric isotonic contraction. And so pretty much any of those actions I gave you guys on either the arm chart or the leg chart, those actions of those muscles are all concentric isotonic contractions. Okay, so again, the action column of those charts I gave you is what the muscle produces when it is completing a concentric isotonic contraction. Okay, so you might want to scribble a little note of that on the charts that you guys have so that when you're making a quick reference to it, good to go, right? So very easy to reference and hopefully straighten out your mind if you're getting a little bit confused. Again, are there any questions at this point? Okay, very good then. Try to look at my feet here. All right. Once again, on the flip grids, I noticed that there was a little bit of confusion about what's happening in your ankles or in your feet. Right now, the lower half of my body is in anatomical position. If I pull my toes out to the sides, right, this is not eversion, right? All of this movement actually didn't happen in my knees. It didn't happen in my ankles. That happened all the way up here in my hips. So this is also lateral rotation at the hip. Even though we see the movement way down here in our feet and our ankles, that's not what's moving. And again, if you actually do this, if you try this on your own, I can't see any of you, we can't see each other. If you try this, you'll feel the movement is actually happening up here in your hips. Your ankles and your knees are kind of locked. Okay, so lateral rotation and back to medial rotation here. And so inversion and eversion is actually moving your ankles, right? So again, if you kind of roll your ankles like this, you'll feel this movement is happening down there, not way up here. Okay, eversion is kind of standing on the flat lateral edge of your feet. Inversion is standing essentially on the medial edge, so on kind of like your big toe side of your feet. So inversion and eversion, okay? And so those movements are produced by calf muscles, right? Not by your hip muscles, okay? The other thing, of course, is plantar flexion is pointing down, right? So pointing your toes, okay? Dorsiflexion is bringing your toes up. So plantar, dorsiflexion, okay? And you know, just like we talked about before, on opposite sides of the joint, so the anterior, so your shin muscles versus your calf muscles are producing opposite movements, okay? So they're antagonists to one another. When your tibialis anterior produces a concentric contraction, okay? Essentially it is pulling your toes up, it is dorsiflexing, but at the same time, your gastrocnemius and your soleus on the other side of your leg has to lengthen. Okay, so this is an antagonist muscle to the tibialis anterior, and therefore it completes an eccentric isotonic contraction when the tibialis anterior produces a concentric isotonic contraction. And so when you guys were hopefully getting to play around a little bit with your chicken leg, hopefully you guys were able to kind of pull on the two opposite muscles. So the hamstrings versus the quadriceps femoris, they produced exactly opposite movements. They are antagonists. Generally, these movements all involve a shortening of one muscle and a lengthening of the other muscle at the same time. The muscles, of course, are on opposite sides of the joint. Okay, does that make sense? You guys need me to talk about that anymore? I know it's a lot to wrap your minds around, but I also know that these are really important concepts. Yeah, back in the day, Stockton used to offer group fitness classes, and a lot of the DPT students would come to those classes. And so it's awesome. I would hear them, you know, with every like dance move or like exercise, they'd be like, this is the muscle, it's a concentric contraction, it's an isometric contraction. So they'd be listing these things off because they just knew this stuff right off the top of their head. And so I know that a few of you are looking to enter into the DPT program. And even if you're not, it's really important to understand what muscles you can use, what muscles you can strengthen if you pull a muscle or something. So good stuff here. Again, any questions at all? Okay. All right. So of course the muscles and how they work, you know, or the movements they produce are really important. That is a significant part of this exam. Other parts of this exam include nerves, right? So we learned about the brachial plexus, we learned about the lumbar and sacral plexuses, and then a couple nerves that are part of those plexuses. If I give you a nerve, you should be able to select from a list which muscle that nerve innervates. And so in general, you should be thinking about where the nerves are. So for example, my friend here, very, very uncoordinated, I'm sorry. Okay, oh my gosh. The lumbar plexus, nerves are going to pass out the intervertebral foramina here. So this is the lumbar spine, and they're going to pass over the pelvis to this side. One of those nerves is the obturator nerve. And so the obturator nerve is actually going to pass through the obturator foramen, which is down here. The pen is within the hole. And so when this nerve passes from the intervertebral foramen through the obturator nerve, what muscles are right here? Right, so right in this particular area here, well, we know that they're on the that the muscles we're trying to figure out are on the medial side of the femur, right? They might attach up here by the pelvis. And so if you look at an image or if you think about it, all of the muscles that are right here in this little triangle are the adductor muscles. And so the obturator nerve is going to innervate. That is, it's going to stimulate contraction. It's going to pick up sensory information about the length and about the feeling of this muscle. Is it sore? Is it shortened? Is it lengthened? So all of this nervous information, afferent and efferent, is passing through the obturator nerve right here to this group of muscles, which are the adductor muscles. Right? So they are going to pull the leg closer to the midline. Right? So if you're riding a horse and you kind of squeeze the belly of the horse with your legs, all of that is done by the adductor muscles. Okay, same thing, another lumbar nerve here. Right, from the lumbar plexus, it passes out over the top of the pelvis and essentially follows the anterior side of the femur. Well, what muscle group is on the anterior side of the femur? Well, the quadriceps femoris muscle, a group of muscles, that is. And so, again, you should be expected to identify which nerves innervate which group of muscles. Just think about where they are, or you can make your own little charts using all those tiles that I put at the end of your PowerPoint presentation. Okay. On the same note, if we turn this guy around, the sacral plexus nerves are all going to exit from the sacrum, of course, and they are going to pass out the posterior side of the sacrum. So this is the back. And so these nerves are essentially going to travel down the posterior side of the leg. Now, if you remember from like the last video of the leg lectures, most of these nerves from the sacral plexus are going to join together, okay? And they are going to pass through this notch right here. Okay, so this notch happens to be the greater sciatic notch, and it's called the greater sciatic notch because this, or the sciatic nerve is going to pass through this notch and all the way down the back of the leg. Also remember that you guys, we all have a nerve, or my gosh, a muscle that originates on the sacrum, passes over this nerve to insert on the greater trochanter of the femur. And so we have this nerve that is kind of wedged up here in the greater sciatic notch, and then we have a muscle that is passing right over it, essentially putting pressure on the sciatic nerve. And so if you are the type of person to stick your phone in your back pocket and sit down on it, or a wallet or whatever, that hard item in your back pocket is pressing the piriformis muscle right on the sciatic nerve, right? Essentially pinching it so it can't send information down or up from the back of your leg. Also, this nerve controls things like your bladder, your urinary bladder, and so incontinence, or the inability to hold your urine, is also associated with damage to this sciatic nerve. Okay, and so hint, hint, nudge, nudge, there is an open-ended question about Fatwallet Syndrome, and so you should be thinking, what nerves are involved? What muscles are involved? What bone, right, specific part of the bone is involved, and all of which interacting when you stick a wallet or a phone in your back pocket and you sit down on it for a long time. Okay, so that being said, any questions about any of that? All right, very good then. Trying to think of what else. Oh, joints in general. I know that the joints lecture was just kind of like thrown in there, you know, kind of whenever you guys had the time to do it. Take home messages from the joint lectures. Any move or any joint that allows a lot of movement, right? So here the hip joint, here the elbow joint, you know, in the hand, any of the phalanges, all of these joints are synovial, which means that they have more or less a full range of movement, limited only by the shape of the joint, right? So the shape of the bones that are coming together in the articulation. And so those are synovial. Synovial joints all have different structures in common, right? So they have synovial fluid, they have ligaments that are holding the bones together. Here it is simply metal, but in our bodies it is, they're ligaments holding the bones together. Articular cartilage, right? Because we have this mobility, we need to protect the ends of those bones to keep them from grinding against each other and making bone spurs, as we talked about for the last part of the course. So the structural class of any of these joints that are able to move, right? The structural class is synovial. The structures involved, right? The articular cartilage, the synovial fluid, etc., is synovial. The functional class instead talks about how much movement there actually is. And in the joint lectures, I told you guys that these classes are a little bit vaguer for the most part. Like, where is the cutoff between a little bit of movement and a lot of movement? Where is the cutoff between, you know, no movement and some, right? Like maybe you stretched that ligament at some point and maybe now a joint moves where it shouldn't move. And so now is it an amphiarthrosis or is it still, you know, functional classes of joints are generally not used very strictly. Instead, we use the functional classes to just describe the movement of a particular joint. And so, again, any of the joints that actually move, right? Any of these wrist joints, any carpal to carpal joint, any carpal to metacarpal joint, whatever, they all move. They're all synovial joints. That's the structural class, and they are diarthrotic, right? So this means full range of movement. Okay, so that's one of the structural classes. Another structural class are the cartilaginous joints, right? And so, of course, we've talked about these before. The pubic symphysis between the two pubic bones. And each of these intervertebral discs, okay, these are all cartilaginous joints. Yes, they have a little bit of movement, right? You can, of course, flex and extend your spine, but there's no synovial fluid. There's no free range of movement. So for the most part, these cartilaginous joints are amphiarthrotic, right? So the functional class would be amphiarthrosis, but generally we use those terms more as an adjective to describe the fact that the intervertebral disc, so the joint between the bodies of the vertebrae, moves only a little bit, but it is still able to move. Okay, so cartilaginous joints is the second type of structural class. The final type, of course, are fibrous joints. And so as you guys will learn very soon here, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, we have lots of joints in our skull, and I don't know if you can see this, but there are little jagged lines, right? In the skull, these are fibrous joints. We call them sutures. And essentially they're fibrous because there are tiny little ligaments that fuse these bones together. Of course, we don't want our skull to be able to flex, right? Our brain is super close to that bone underneath. And so we don't want any movement whatsoever, even though these in fact are joints. And so these are fibrous joints. They have no movement whatsoever. Okay. Again, any questions about that? On the test, you should be able to identify the structural and functional classes of different types of joints. I will only give you the ones that, or I would only test you on the ones that I have shown you before in the lecture. Okay, so that would be it for that. again, any questions for me? Any clarification that you guys need? One of the perks to showing up to these optional Zoom sessions is that you do get to ask questions right away. Okie dokie then. All right, I think that's, oh, almost it. All right, so we've talked about physiology a little bit. I've said multiple times at this point that the focus of the lab, so those photos of models and everything, is really just like, what is this and what is this? So what is the anatomy? The focus of the lecture is essentially getting you guys to talk about how this structure matches the function, and so it's much more of a physiological approach in the lecture. And so you guys, of course, learned all sorts of different bumps and grooves and everything within the lab / lecture, a heck of a lot of overlap at this point in life. How does that, or how can we talk about the physiology of that? And so for a lecture exam, instead of just saying, this is the head of the humerus, you should also be able to tell me that the head of the humerus articulates with the glenoid cavity of the scapula, right? So what attaches to what? A joint, right? Humerus, head, and glenoid cavity of the scapula, right? Down here in the elbow, we have the trochlea of the humerus articulating with the trochlear notch of the ulna, right? And so you should definitely know what joins with what on the skeleton. The other thing is kind of getting you guys to think about the point, like what is the purpose of this big old bump right here? Okay, so this happens to be one of them that you can feel through your skin, right? And so if you have this pointy part of your elbow, right? So when you put your elbows on the table, this is what is actually on the table, right? So that's the olecranon process. If you run your finger medially, right? There's this other little bump right here. That bump happens to be this bump right here. It is the medial epicondyle, and this is important for us. And so this is where the physiology starts coming in. This is important for us because all of the flexor muscles, right, on the anterior side of the forearm are all going to originate on the medial epicondyle or around somewhere close to the medial epicondyle. And so, we know if this is the origin and the insertions are all sorts of different places on the wrist, then we can figure out what movement the wrist is going to make based on insertion being pulled towards origin. Okay, knowing what muscles attach to these different bumps and grooves and everything is super important. Again, I will pause for any questions while I'm trying to think of anything that I have neglected to point out.
I was wondering if we could go over the nerves in the arm on the diagram.
Yeah. Yes, they, the arm is kind of rough.
Yeah, I didn't really do too well on that part.
Sorry. Whether we are in person or online, every single semester, it is the muscles and the nerves of the arm that prove to be the most challenging. And if you guys have any ideas for me on how maybe that could not be the case, by all means, let me know. Because it just seems hard. All right, so on the diagram is what you said, right? I think so.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Let me share.
And it wasn't really even so much the lateral side, it was more so the medial side.
The medial side, okay.
Yeah.
So here is the PowerPoint. So this here So the nerves, okay, nope, that's not gonna work. There's so many windows up on my screen. Okay. All right, so here's the brachial plexus, right? We know that the nerves come together, split apart, come together, split apart. Ultimately, at the end of all of this craziness, we can see a nerve that passes through the armpit. We call it the essentially armpit nerve, right? It wraps through, through the axillary region, through the armpit, and wraps around to the outside of your shoulder, right? So the only muscle that's right here is this nice triangular muscle, the deltoid muscle. So axillary nerve innervates the deltoid muscle. All right, from there, we can see that these nerves kind of split. One nerve is going to run down the pinky side of your hand, or pinky side of your forearm, that is. This particular nerve actually passes posterior to this little bump, the medial epicondyle that we were just talking about. And so actually when you hit your funny bone, you're actually hitting the medial epicondyle of your humerus, and it hurts so darn much that it's just not funny, right? Because you're actually like pinching that nerve right there. And that nerve is the one that runs along with the ulna, and so we call it the ulnar nerve. Okay. Even though the ulnar nerve is passing behind or posterior to this medial epicondyle, it wraps around and it's going to travel down the anterior side of your forearm. And so what muscles are there? They happen to be the muscles that are all originating on that same medial epicondyle. So the nerve runs from the medial epicondyle and with all of those muscles that originate there as well. And so the flexor muscles, or at least the medial flexor muscles, are going to be innervated by the the ulnar nerve. Hopefully that makes sense. That's like the medial nerve here. All right, on the other side, we have the radial nerve. And so if we go, go over here, we can see the radial nerve is green. It actually passes on the anterior side of the elbow, but then it wraps around to the back of the elbow, okay? And so it is essentially passing by the lateral epicondyle. And so the lateral epicondyle happens to be where all of the extensor muscles of the wrist are originating, right? So over here is where they start, and they are going to pass along the back of your forearm. And so the radial nerve does exactly the same thing. It passes by the lateral epicondyle and then along the back of your arm with all of those extensor muscles. You know, the radial nerve is next to the extensor muscles and therefore it innervates them. Again, so maybe the only one that like doesn't just logically make sense necessarily is the median nerve, right? So the ulna is on the medial side, the radius is on the lateral side. In the middle is the median. And so pretty much any of those medial muscles, right? So not the, or any of those more lateral muscles of the front of your arm are going to be innervated by a nerve that travels down pretty much the middle of your anterior forearm. Okay, so here is where the ulnar nerve is, here is where the median nerve is, and so any muscles that are here is median, and any muscles that are here, like when you put your arms on the table, you know, this part of your arm is on the table, all of those muscles are ulnar nerve muscles. Did that answer your question, or did I just like completely miss the point of what you were shooting for?
No, it answered. You answered my question. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. All right. And of course, there are these little plaques here that essentially tell you exactly what muscles are innervated. You could memorize a list like that. I generally do not work very well that way. I need to like visualize it and just logically figure out what muscles are closest to those particular nerves. But some people are better at just like rote memorization, so whatever works for you. Anything else I can answer for you guys? All right, there's one more thing, and this is kind of jumping into what happens next. I know that we're all very much focused on exam number 3 right now. Very good. Please focus on exam number 3. What's coming up next? And it comes up very quickly. If you look at the schedule, Thursday is supposed to be, tomorrow is supposed to be the beginning of exam 4 information. And so this section is going to start with just introducing you to a lot of bones and muscles and special sensory structures. I recognize that there are so many different images, so many different models in this part, and there really isn't an abundance of time for you guys to sit there and label every single one. However, there is a lot of value in doing labeling itself, right? So you can look up an image that is already labeled, right? But it's not going to help you actually learn that image. You need to actively interact with the models, with the images, in order to solidify it in your mind. You know, one expression always stayed with me: the one who does the work does the learning. And so by watching a video and actually you yourself drawing the lines, it helps you be the one doing the work, and therefore you to learn. And so you need to find some balance between those two things. And so your final lab assignment is kind of coming back around to do what we did in the very beginning of this class. I'm going to share with you guys another Google Slides document. In this document, I have added the photos that I would normally give you guys exclusively on Blackboard. You'll have a link to watch videos of me like actually walking through you know, the same models. You know, this is this. And so normally you would go through and you would label all of these things all by yourself, but to earn 3% credit, as well as to practice for yourself and to help out your fellow classmates, each of you guys will be randomly assigned to one of these slides with a couple pictures each. I will put your name up here. So just kind of scroll through to find your name. It'll probably be alphabetical. And down here, I am going to paste in the terms of the structures that you can actually see on the models that I've provided for you. And so your job will be to take those terms and to label them appropriately. So for example, this here is the vomer bone. I point that out to you on the videos. And so at the end, you'll have a bunch of different labels, a bunch of different arrows, but this will be the only set of models that you absolutely have to do that for. And one classmate will do this set, another classmate will do this set, and so on and so forth. And so you're going to get credit for doing it. You're going to get some practice, and you don't have to do this for every single one. Now, of course, you need to, of course, trust that your classmates have labeled things appropriately. And so once this is due, I am going to go through and check and make sure that the labels are correct. And if a slide is totally correct, I'll put a little smiley face, good to go. You can study this from here on out. Okay. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Or if it doesn't. Okay, awesome, very good. Yes, that is the next step. It is supposed to be this week, so keep it in the back of your mind. But you guys will have this afternoon and evening and all day tomorrow for exam number 3. Okay, so hopefully that will be beneficial. Anyone need to see any other models or have any other questions about format, content, anything at all? For the quiz and practical, Yes, so definitely for the lab quiz, I always go back and check those answers. Of course, I haven't gotten to that yet because it was just due like an hour ago. So I will make sure that the grades are correct, and I will do that as soon as physically possible. The leg quiz, I can check through and make sure that that's okay as well. It seemed like the grades were pretty high, which is encouraging, but I will definitely make sure that all the answers were correct. If they weren't, I'll fix it and your grades will immediately reflect that. And of course, I don't know if you guys saw, but I did get the exam 2 grades up. And so grades are more up to date so that you know where you are going into exam number 3. Yeah, no worries, it's all good. Good questions. There's a lot of different moving parts to this class, and I really appreciate you guys letting me know if I overlooked something. I'm only human, and this course moves just as quickly for me as it does for you. Okay, well, if that is all the questions, I will let you go. I will, of course, post this on YouTube as soon as it will convert, upload, process, etc. So hopefully within the next hour, this will be up. Okay. Once again, thank you guys so much for coming. 1 week left. And I'll see you guys later.